ladies and gentlemen. I would like to give a warm welcome to our most wonderful guest of this evening, Neil MacGregor, who directly came from Berlin or London or even Mumbai. We will talk about this later on. We are very happy, Neil, that you agreed to come to the Kunsthistorisches Museum to be part of our modern and contemporary talks. We are very anxious to hear more about your career and about the challenges that you are facing, that you have been facing, and the challenges that you are facing now. Neil MacGregor was born in Glasgow into a family of doctors. And I will ask you later how you were initiated into art, what made you want to study art history. Neil studied languages, German and French in Oxford, then studied philosophy in Paris, and finally art history at the Courtauld Institute in London. Then, starting from 1981 through 1987, Neil was editor of the Burlington Magazine, a scholarly magazine on art and decorative arts, still extant today, and a magazine that everyone, of course, reads. And then in 1987, Neil changed into the museums world and became director of the National Gallery in London. He was director there until 2002, and after this he changed to the British Museum and became director of the British Museum, most successful until 2015, when you decided to step down and become founding director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. You are also very famous for your BBC series that we will talk about this later on, and you're also active as an advisor in Mumbai. We will speak about this. And now, for tonight, we're very happy that you agreed to come to Vienna, to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, a museum that you know very well. We have collaborated in many ways, and we are very happy to have you here, Neil. A warm welcome. Well, Neil, as I said, you were born in Glasgow, born into a family of doctors. Both of your parents were doctors. I'm sure they were probably hoping that you would also become a medicine. What was your initiation into art? Do you remember?
Thank you. May I first of all thank you very much for the invitation, and to say how wonderful it is to be here with you, Sabine, a valued colleague, and with Wilfried Seipel, also a valued colleague, and to be once again under this amazing, amazing roof. I suppose, like many people, the first encounter with art really came just by seeing a picture that excited you. And when I was 8 years old in Glasgow, the city of Glasgow bought a picture by Salvador Dali of Christ on the cross in the sky. I now think it's a terrible picture. But when I was 8 years old, I thought it was the most wonderful thing I had ever seen. It caused a great excitement in Glasgow, because Glasgow was a city then very divided between Catholics and Protestants, rather like Northern Ireland. And this was a very Catholic picture bought by the Protestant authorities. So it was a great act of reconciliation. So we all went to look at it. And most of you, I suspect, don't know it, but the cross is hanging on the sky. And Christ, without nails, is also hanging on the cross in the sky. And it's painted hyper-realist. And what I found fascinating as a child was that you can paint so completely realistic something that cannot exist and something that cannot happen. And that started me going to the museum. The museum in Glasgow is like many big city museums. It has natural history. So there were stuffed polar bears and giraffes and there were ship models and all the rest. And then upstairs there was Rembrandt and that sort of thing. So it's a very good place for a child to wander around. And that's where it began.
And then you became editor of the Burlington Magazine, which was really dealing with the academics of the world, with professors, with scholars, with also, of course, collectors. And then you decided to move into the museums world, which is, of course, something completely different. And you became a very successful museum director at the National Gallery in London, which is one of the most preeminent museums, of course, in England, in London. It's the National Gallery. It's dedicated to paintings. And you had most famous predecessors, and there was Neil, and was interested in which were the challenges for you. What were your expectations changing from being an editor, being strictly in the academic theory fields, then really moving on to the museum?
Thank you. I think the great tradition of the National Gallery, particularly of the National Gallery, has always been that it's right in the middle of London, and it's always been open free to everybody since 1824. And it's a kind of accident, as always in Britain, because the British government is extraordinarily mean when it comes to culture. It will never spend money, and never. And what happened was the British Museum had been founded in 1753. So the museum existed already. And the museum had the prints and drawings and the antiquities and the library as well. And then, but there were no paintings. And in the 1820s, the government decided to buy a collection of paintings to add to the British Museum, as you would expect. They bought the paintings, and then they decided that they didn't have any money left to put up a building. So the paintings were left on their own in a private house for 20 years until the National Gallery was built, by which stage everybody decided they liked the paintings on their own, and they liked looking just at paintings. Why I wanted to work at the National Gallery was two reasons. Firstly, because the collection of the National Gallery is an expression of what Europe is. This is the other house, I think, of which that's true, but for completely different reasons. This house is the story of Europe because the Habsburgs are the story of Europe. And what happened with the Habsburg family is what happened to Europe. The National Gallery collection was bought picture by picture to tell the story of Europe. And to develop that story and work with that story was something I wanted to do very much. There are very few places where you can walk around Europe as you can in the National Gallery. And that was always the intention. The other thing that interested me so much was the idea of the public coming in. Most of the visitors in the National Gallery spend less than half an hour in the building and come to look at one picture or two pictures because they come regularly. And that great tradition is a very, very important one because one of the things I imagine we want to talk about is how do you make a great collection of pictures part of the everyday life of a city? How do you make a public collection the private collection of every citizen? And that's what seems to me so interesting about the tradition of the National Gallery and why I wanted to work there.
And when you, of course, you studied the collections very intensely, and one of the privileges, of course, of a director is to make acquisitions, to kind of shape the profile of the collections, to kind of hunt after interesting paintings, works of art. Did you, when you studied the collections, did you realize that there was a profile you just wanted to enrich, or did you feel that there were gaps? And what was your intention to shape the contents of the National Gallery?
Thank you. As you know very well, there are always gaps.
No, yes.
But the question that seemed to me important was really the representation of the whole of Europe. As many of you will know, the extraordinary thing about the National Gallery is that it has very few British paintings, only those British paintings that were thought to be good enough to hang beside Italian and Dutch paintings. And the collection represents the tastes of British collectors, or had done very largely. So it's very largely an Italian, French, Dutch, Flemish, Spanish collection. The first obvious gap was the German painting. German painting had never been collected in the early 19th century. And because of the catastrophe of the 20th century, there was a reluctance to buy German painting. So that was one challenge. But there was also the question of the rest of Europe. Our view of what Europe is in the artistic world is still, I think, very much driven by France and the Mediterranean, above all the Mediterranean. And it seemed very important to focus the acquisitions on the north of Europe and try to redefine the canon of European painting if we could.
Shall we have a look at this one?
So this was one example. And all our acquisitions have to be approved by the trustees. Our trustees are extremely distinguished people from all kinds of parts of life. And they're not people who give us money. They're there to represent the public. When I presented a painting by the great Finnish artist Kalingallela, I think I can honestly say not one trustee had ever heard of Kalingallela. It was a very interesting discussion. They were much more used to being offered a Van Dyck or a Poussin. And we all felt, the curatorial team, that this was a great landscape, and a landscape in a very, very important tradition of Scandinavian painting that should be present, and that this was at the right level to hang beside the great landscapes of Rubens and Poussin and Cézanne. And the pleasing thing is that the public have fallen in love with this picture. It is now one of the 4 best-selling postcards in the museum. And to such an extent that there is now, by public demand, a Kalingallela exhibition at the National Gallery.
I was just going to ask, yes, did you ever have an exhibition on this Finnish?
No, because that would have been too difficult, because at that stage, we need sponsors for our exhibitions. Now, it's difficult enough in life if your trustees haven't heard of the artist. It's impossible if the sponsors haven't. But there is now a sponsored Kalingallela exhibition at the National Gallery.
And has the collection acquired more Scandinavian paintings? Is there
yes,
more
it has.
of a focus?
It's been it's quite a small collection, as you know. It's only 2,000 paintings, and the quality has to be the right quality. But there's been a steady increase in Northern European painting. And the public enjoy that very much. And I think it's one of the roles of the museum. It's the great privilege that a house like this or a house like the National Gallery has, is that if you present a new artist, the public will take it seriously. They will look and think about it. So you can really change people's perception of who the great artists are and which the interesting schools of European painting are.
And do you recall the criteria or the arguments that you presented, for example, to the trustees to make them more prone to support this?
The first thing was that it's a very beautiful painting and a very accomplished one. And compositionally, if one's thinking in terms of structure, one that sits extremely interestingly beside Poussin and Cézanne, where you also have these abstract patternings on the surface that also reflect an intellectual or a mythical religious idea behind, which is certainly the case in this picture. But it was essentially just the quality of it as a painting.
You, in the National Gallery, of course, you mainly worked with dead artists, but you also had the privilege to work with contemporary artists, with living artists. And there is this wonderful photograph by David Dawson showing you together in conversation with Lucien Freud. And I also picked this because we had an exhibition with works of Lucien Freud towards the end of his life. We kind of worked the checklist together with him while he was still alive, and he said at the very end of his life there were only 2 museums that he was interested to see his works presented. One was the Prado and the other one was the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And also mainly because he had this strong interest in some of the old masters. And I picked this painting by Chardin because he was interested in that. And of course you ask what was the intention of Freud, first of all, to work in the National Gallery. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this. What are your memories about working with Lucien? How did he work? And what was really the special feel about this?
Yes, thank you. One of the old traditions of the National Gallery, and I don't know how much it's a tradition here as well, because the National Gallery was created by Parliament in 1824, it was created with a purpose. And there were 2 purposes. The first purpose was that the poor should be able to enjoy the same pleasure of paintings as the rich. And if you did that, you wouldn't have a revolution on the unpleasant French model, which worked. But Parliament debates this at great length, and that's why the gallery is in Trafalgar Square, because it's in the center of the city, which means the poor could walk from the east and the rich could drive from the west. And they would all meet in front of the paintings and social harmony would be the result. That was the first one. The second purpose of the National Gallery was that it was going to improve taste and create a great school of British painting, because there was a great concern that British painting wasn't as good as it should be. And because of that, artists from the very beginning had special privileges in the collection. What that now means today, there was for a long time a day when artists could come and copy, and it was closed to the public. That has stopped. But what happens now is that the trustees give to distinguished artists a pass that lets them come to the gallery at night. So when the museum is closed, the artists can come and walk and work. And Lucien, of course, had a pass, and he worked at night. Lucien Freud would never, ever come out of his studio during the day, because he said he had a limited amount of time in his life, and he wanted all the daylight hours to be spent painting. So you either saw him for breakfast between 7 and 8:30 before the day began, or else he would come to the National Gallery, usually at 2 in the morning. And I don't think he ever slept, really. So if you walked around the gallery at night, you would often find Lucien painting. And he, like all artists, he had spent most of his student time copying in the galleries. He knew the collection extremely well. And he said, for him, it was like going to the doctors. When there was a problem, you went to see how Veronese had done it, or how or how Van Dyck had solved it. And one evening when we were talking and walking around, he asked me what I thought was the most interesting ear that had been painted in the National Gallery. We all knew who had painted the best hands, but who was the best painter of ears? It's a very interesting, I have to say, I was ashamed to admit I had never even asked the question, let alone had an answer. And he walked me straight away to this picture. And the reason he loved this picture was because he thinks that the little schoolmistress has the most interesting ear ever painted in Europe. So when you next have a chance to look close, look at the ear. And he's right, because as always with an artist, the joy of this is that when artists look at paintings, they see things that we never would. He then made a very interesting lithograph etching after it. But he was very, very interested in painting in that kind of way. And the tradition of asking artists to make a collection from a selection from the National Gallery of the pictures that had meant most to them and say why was always very, very fascinating.
Of course, you know, the Kunsthistorisches Museum doesn't collect modern and contemporary art. Our collections stop around 1800. Nevertheless, we're interested in working with modern and contemporary artists in a very precise way, even though we don't acquire works. But we think it's necessary for us and also necessary for our audiences to kind of understand the old masters from a modern point of view, to kind of build or walk on the bridge between old and contemporary. What is your view on that, your experience in working with modern and contemporary art in a historic collection?
Well, as I say, I think it's essential because these collections are really great stores of electric energy that will change the way people see and people think, and above all, artists. And to allow artists to demonstrate that is, I think, very important. They can demonstrate it in a way nothing else can. So we had the tradition of asking artists to make a selection and then present their own paintings as well in the context of the pictures that they had worked with. And that, of course, allows you to put together in an exhibition pictures which you would never put together for any academic or historical reason. And it allows the visitors to see them with different eyes. There was also a very strong program of an artist in residence, which was a very brave thing for many artists. The condition of that is the artist comes and spends a year in the gallery, and once a week has to open their studio and show what's going on and explain how they start making paintings and what it means to them. Because I think the hardest thing for most people to imagine is that there was a stage when Chardin could have made a different painting, could have made many different paintings, and why he wound up choosing that and the process from which the painting we know actually emerges. So that, I think, is very, very important. And although we can't collect, or we don't collect in the National Gallery after about 1900, we regularly exhibit contemporary painting with old master painting, and that, I think, is also a very interesting way to do it.
Yeah, the National Gallery had this format, the artist choice, where artists picked works from the collection and assembled them in a very subjective way. This is actually a program that we have also implemented in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. We think in a very successful way. We've worked with very different artists like Ed Ruscha, or on the other hand, it couldn't be more to the contrary. I think Edmund de Waal, who worked with us. And now we are currently working with Wes Anderson and Human Malouf. They again bring in a different view of the collections, and for us it's always highly instructive. And on the one hand, of course, it's a challenge to our curators who have to open up the collections and accept that there are different views and different interpretations of how you could see a collection, but at the end it's always an enrichment of knowledge, of understanding and different views. So I think this is quite crucial.
I think that's right. I think a collection like the National Gallery collection, or like this collection, in a sense it's like an opera house. You have quite a small repertoire of great works, and how you reinterpret them, how you keep saying that this means something we hadn't yet thought. I mean, the question is always, why do these pictures matter to us today? And why is all great art about your experience now? And I think the great challenge for houses like this is how to make it absolutely clear that the great paintings are, of course, part of a tradition of artistic creation, but they're really about what it means to be a human being and to address the world, and different ways of making that clear, like different productions of opera, are, I think, very, very important.
When you think back to the time when you were director at the National Gallery, I'm sure you had the same audiences as we had. But how did you work on younger people? You said that you wanted the paintings in the National Gallery to become part of everybody's life, that they would have a more natural entrance to the museum, live with the works and feel and experience art as part of their daily life, so to say. How did you address younger generations?
Well, working with contemporary artists helps, of course, a lot. Obviously, just as you do, a great, very extensive school programs so that people get the habit of coming in. And then really a great deal with television and radio as the way of reaching a public that wouldn't come, not just a young public, but especially a young public. Television is such a helpful way. And we're lucky in having in the BBC a broadcaster that wants to work with public institutions, and that allows one to do a great deal.
And your work with the BBC, especially the radio series, was, I think, quite innovative, very new at that time, that a museum director would use that medium to make art a topic.
I think it's about getting because the pictures can't really come. Particularly the pictures cannot come into the public space. They require security, they require climate control. So you have to how do you get the pictures to the people when you can't take them there? I mean, you obviously tour them a great deal if you can, but that's difficult. But it's really very much about public program and getting people like artists with whom the young are interested to talk about them, but also other people, making sure that other kinds of commentators also talk about the collection.
That's maybe the point to move on to your time and your directorship of the British Museum. From 2002 to 2015, you were director of the British Museum, widely acclaimed, widely popular, also because you opened up the museum to a wider public, and just as you explained, not only by explaining art within the limits of the museum, but also bringing the art and the ideas and the collections to the public, to the audiences by your radio series, the BBC radio series. It must have been extremely difficult to talk about art, works of art, objects that the people couldn't see, but you had to describe them, you had to bring them into a wider context. How did you do that project? How did you work? Was it only you, Neil, or did you have the curators? Did you have other journalists working with you?
The project was really, again, the question I think that we all need to ask about these collections is, why do they matter today? Why do you need them? Why do we need to have collections like these? And why do we need collections like the British Museum, like the Weltmuseum? How do they change the way we think about the world? Because that's what they were all meant to do. And the question you need to keep asking is, how does that now happen? And it was a very important question, I think, for a collection like the British Museum, because the idea of a museum with objects from all over the world is very much an idea of the 18th century, of the Aufklärung, that all humanity is in some ways connected and some ways similar. And there's a constant tension, I think, between the idea of that 18th century idea of the Aufklärung and the 19th century idea of national difference. And you have to decide which view of the world you take. A museum like the British Museum, like the Weltmuseum, is based on the idea that there is a connection and that we are all somehow connected with these things that have been made wherever they're made. How do you get that? How do you make that possible to a public? And how do you do it particularly in a museum which, like all museums, has grown up over a long time? The building is in a terrible state. I know your government is much more generous than ours, but even your building must have problems. Some of the building is leaking, some of the building is cold, and you can't move Egyptian sculpture around and see how it would look in a different room because you need lorries to move it, and so on. So it's very difficult with a big museum like that, a big collection, really to present a different reading of it. It's much easier with paintings. And one of the big disappointments I had was to discover that when you're looking at Assyrian sculpture, you can't just rehang it the way you can a room of Titian or whatever. So what we did as a whole team, the whole museum, was sort out what, if we were thinking, what can this house do that really no other collection can? And because of the scope of the collection and the age of it, it was possible to think that you could go through the whole of human history and take an object, and an object is not, because it's not there principally as a work of art, although some of them are works of art, you can tell the story of what it was made for, but then how it came ultimately to be in London. So the life of an object runs, of course, across many, many centuries and can tell many, many stories. And so the first thing was working with the colleagues to choose the objects. And that was great fun, because having all we decided we would do it by chronology. So we have all the curators together and say, we want to look at the world in the year 1000 BC, 1000 before Christ. And what are the questions for the world that we can address through the collection? And what is Egypt doing? What is China doing? What is Mexico doing? Even if there's no connection between them, what is going on? And of course, the curators had never spoken to each other like that, because that's not an academic question. There is no connection. It doesn't, so it allowed a kind of discussion between the curators, which had never taken place, and then we came to the choice. The great advantage, I think, of radio over television is that it's like reading a novel rather than seeing a film. If you only have words, you have to make the picture. And that means you possess the object in a quite different way. Just as when you read the novel, you know what that person looks like, because you have to make that person. And you know that person quite differently from seeing them in a film where it's given to you. And I think that's a very interesting question about how we understand things and how we make things our own. Because all this is about how do you make the collection belong to everybody. And radio is very good for that, I think. And
this, I think, has already almost become a trademark for your work, that you have developed several BBC radio series. Another one has just started, Living with the Gods, which deals with religion, with faith, and how does religion and faith shape societies. It seems that these topics run throughout your whole career, throughout your thinking, your writings, your exhibition. Do you think this is really one of the big topics of society nowadays?
It's partly a tradition of the museum tradition in Britain. I mean, because we didn't have a revolution, it means that the royal collections are still private. So every collection, public collection in Britain, was the decision of Parliament to do it for the people. So we've had a quite different set of debates about why you need these things. And the argument has always been that the collections, of course, belong to the public, but the point of the collections is to make a different kind of citizen, to allow the citizen to ask questions which question what the government is doing. In a very interesting way, particularly the British Museum, it was set up with trustees so that it would not be controlled by the government in the 1750s, so that you could have a debate about the world that was not controlled by the Crown. And this is the central point of all our collections. How do they allow us to think about the world, to question the world now? it's why a collection at the Weltmuseum is so important, because if you look at the questions of, so what are the important questions now? You can look at them historically through the objects. It seemed to us at the British Museum that, for instance, looking at what are the questions to understand the world now, one of the questions, this was 10 years ago, had to be, what does the world look like from Iran? If you are from Iran, how do you understand the world? And the collections will let you do that in some measure. The same with Germany, very important in Britain, where the perception of Germany was so marked by the war. But now, I think most of us would agree, if looking at the world, one of the big questions is, why is religion politically so important? When 50 years ago, 100 years ago, everybody thought, everybody in the intellectual world imagined religion would decline and stop being such a public force. And that's the question that you can look at, I think.
Exactly. To the contrary now is the situation. And so you share our belief that museums can contribute quite a bit to the public debate, to shape society, to have some kind of diplomacy.
I think it's the two things, and I don't know how you would, I don't know your view of this. I think the main purpose is to allow the citizen to ask questions in a different way. The museum can't provide the answers. What the museum can do is provide a different framework for the questions. If you something like religion, and why is religion politically so important? To look historically at ways in which, in different cultures, religion and society, religion and politics have worked, then you can ask the questions about today in a different way. That's one thing. And there, I think the role of the museum is to open and frame and give a framework for the debate. The diplomacy is a different question, because there you can do something very special. There the museum can really lead. And one of the people I think we both admire very much at the moment is Michael Petrovsky in Petersburg, who, as the relations between Russia and other countries have become more difficult, more and more the Hermitage insists that we can cooperate, we must cooperate.
You did a very interesting cooperation with the State Hermitage in St. Petersburg. You very often spoke about the British Museum as a lending library, also in connection with lending the objects, always free of charge, which is also, you have free entrance, you are free of charge. This, I think, is a very strong statement. And how did it come about that you lent one piece of the Elgin marbles to the State Hermitage? You had this strong debate, and debate is probably not a strong enough word, with Greece. And all of a sudden you lent one of these pieces to St. Petersburg. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? Because this was really a very remarkable gesture.
Yes, in that question about the debate about a culture that belongs to everybody and is really world heritage, which means, or whether it's a national possession, obviously the Parthenon sculptures have come to play a very important part. It seems to me that the question is only part of a much bigger one. It's not a question, I think, of whether the objects are mainly held in one city or in one other city. The question is, how does the rest of the world see these? How can they be shared with the whole world? So it was very important to lend the Parthenon sculptures. They are, of course, of enormous importance for not just European culture, but around the world. And the Hermitage was celebrating its 250th anniversary. The Hermitage wanted to make a great statement that its collections also belong not just to Russia, but to the world, and that the point of a house like that is to insist that we are all citizens of the world. And it seemed the obvious moment. The British Museum is the oldest national museum in the world, and the Hermitage the second one. So this seemed the ideal statement to make, that these two museums, that both are tied up with national governments, national politics, of course, they have to be, but this seemed the ideal statement to make, that these collections, this is an ideal about a republic of letters, about a world where we really do mean this when we say these belong to everybody. And that's why it was so important to make that statement. It's a statement about what a universal museum is for.
Do you recall the reactions by the people in Russia to this really generous and very important statement?
It was extremely touching. Huge numbers of people came to look at the sculpture that went. But it was very extraordinary being in the building and people coming up to me and saying thank you and all the rest of it. Because one of the very interesting things, as you know, one of the reasons the Parthenon sculptures were so important is because they were the first really Greek sculptures to be seen in Western Europe, not Roman copies, which is why they caused a sensation. The ancient sculpture, the antique sculpture in the Hermitage is almost exclusively Roman copies. So for the Parthenon sculptures to go to Petersburg was actually very like the Parthenon sculptures coming to London in 1806. That same shock of seeing a real Greek sculpture among the Roman copies. And everybody, it was a very bad moment diplomatically. And again, what was very touching was the number of people who said how particularly pleased they were because this was a difficult moment between our governments. Our government, I think, the great freedom we have in the British Museum is we could send this without telling the government. Well, we tell them 24 hours beforehand so that they could prepare the press statement. But because we are really independent, we didn't need authorization, but it really did mean that this was from one museum to the other.
This is a situation that is unthinkable of in Austria, I have to say, but we're very happy that things like this can happen. We were talking briefly, or you mentioned Germany. The exhibition you did, Germany, Memories of a Nation, was also groundbreaking, I think. Of course, it was the question, how did it come about that an Englishman does an exhibition in Britain on Germany? What were your driving forces behind doing this?
Well, as I said, it's what the purpose of the museum is. And the purpose is to allow the citizen to understand better the world now and to ask questions now. If we're thinking about Europe at the moment, then it is clearly extremely important for everybody to understand Germany and how Germany now is and Germany thinks. In Britain, that's been made very, very difficult by the fact that the only German history that people learn in school and mostly study at university is entirely 20th century. And is overwhelmingly, of course, 1933 to 1945. This makes it very, very difficult for most British people to understand or to imagine what Germany is like now. So it seemed very important. German colleagues were rather upset when I compared it with doing an exhibition on Iran. But it is the same phenomenon. Because we don't learn about the history of Iran, we don't know that Iran has always been the great imperial power of the Middle East, and that Iran thinks it's completely natural that it should decide what happens from the Mediterranean to the Indus. But once that is historically there, the modern world is differently understandable. And we have great collections from Germany, so it seemed, again, a very good way to try to do it. And what was interesting, I think, was that many German friends said, of course, it would have been almost impossible for a German to do this, because we began, one of the many things that of course, everybody in Vienna knows, everybody in the German-speaking world knows, but what very few people in Britain know is that Germany, the word German-speaking, German settlements, all the way to the Volga. This is completely unknown. So we began the exhibition and we began the radio programs in Kaliningrad and in Strasbourg as two German cities that were no longer German cities. This was for the British public, this made something very quickly, very clear. I think it's fair to say that it would have been very difficult for any German person to begin an exhibition about Germany in Kaliningrad and Strasbourg as German cities. And that freedom is why I think that freedom particularly in these historical issues, is a very powerful one. And it allowed, I think, us to explain to a British public why the notion of a German state is so different from the French state or the British state.
And did this pave this exhibition and thinking thoroughly about Germany and its history, did this pave the way more or less to your later focus to the Humboldt Forum in Berlin? You became founding director of the Humboldt Forum in 2015, together with Hermann Partzinger and Horst Bredekamp. And it's a project that is widely discussed, has a lot of attendance and also attraction, but also presence in various media. And of course, we are anxious to know and curious to learn more from you about this project, the status, your role in it, your expectations.
Thank you. I was very honored to be asked to be part of this project. It is, as you know, an extremely complex project with a long history. And I think rather unusually in a museum project, the building has been almost as controversial as the whole museum project. The decision to reconstruct the facades of the building as the old Stadtschloss that was demolished by the Soviets in 1951, even though it could have been rebuilt after the war, was already, that's one political debate, particularly because it involved demolishing the Palast der Republik from East Berlin. But the really interesting idea, I think, is to bring from Dahlem the collections from Africa, Oceania, the Americas, from Asia, and put them on the Museumsinsel beside the collections from the Mediterranean. And I think one of the really interesting, difficult things, I think, for Europe at the moment is to rethink the map of the world. And if you look at Paris, what is so interesting about the museums in Paris is that the Louvre is the museum of the classical world and the biblical world. It's the Mediterranean as known through the Greek and Roman authors and the Bible. So it goes to Persia and then it stops. And there are little bits like Germany and Britain as well, but that's an accident really. It's really the Mediterranean. And it's the Mediterranean of Tacitus and of the Bible. And then you have Guimet, which is for the high civilizations of Asia, and then you have the others in the Quai Branly. It's a 19th century division of the world, which is built now into institutions. And this is the way all Europeans thought, of course, until 1900. It's a way that we know we can no longer think. It's, in a sense, what was represented also in Berlin, because the museums on the island, the Antikensammlung and so on, are like the Louvre. That's the same world of the classical world and the Bible. And now coming at the same level to put beside it are these other collections. So it is a very, very important statement. It's what was so important when we were trying to do the history of the world in 100 objects. What an object history lets you do is it puts on the same level civilizations without writing as those that have writing. And that's the most important thing to do. We are so focused on writing in our history that if you go through the things, then you really can have an equal conversation across the world. That's the great challenge here. And if we can do that, that will be very, very powerful indeed. And to try to put these collections on the same footing as the other civilizations, the other cultures, that will, I think, be a great achievement.
Maybe we... Yeah, maybe we skip to a recent discussion you had at the Humboldt Forum. The cupola is reconstructed, and then the question arose what to do with the cross that used to be there. Shall it be placed back, or shall it be substituted by another religious symbol? Is it a religious symbol? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. Germany is a very surprising place. And one of the many surprises is what become questions and problems. Because, for obvious historical reasons, Germany has a more rigorous debate with its own history than any other country in Europe. The decision was taken by the Bundestag to reconstruct the historical facades. And the model put forward by the architect had a complete reconstruction with on the top of the cupola that you see there, the cross, which was put up in the late 1850s. When it was clear that it was going to be put up again, there was outrage at how can you put a cross on top of a museum that is going to have Islamic material in it and Buddhist material and Hindu material, and this would be an offense to everybody inside, and so on. Is it just a historical sign, or does it mean something now? And this is a wonderful cartoon that appeared of the other things that could be put on top. And it raises very, very interesting debate, I think, very interesting discussions about, first of all, how a state institution, a public institution, should address questions of religion, if they should. I mean, in France, the division is so absolute, but in Germany much less, and by us, again, much less. Or whether you can say the cross is simply a historic element, and it means nothing in terms of religion, just as the reconstructed facade is no longer about military triumph, even though the eagles are there and so on. It is a historic reconstruction. And that, I think, is a very, very interesting debate. I think you're very, very lucky in the house in which the Weltmuseum is, because it is what it is so much. And because the collections are in large measure made by the imperial family, so a house built by and for the imperial family, there's an absolute equivalence between the building and the collection. But I think it does raise the question of the debates about questions like religion. Should public institutions talk about the substance of religion? There would be a question here with the paintings, the subject of so many paintings. In how far should one regard that as a question to address and discuss in terms of the collection?
I would just, before we open up to questions from the audience, I would just like to mention that you have also shifted your focus and your support and your expertise to India. Following your leadership in the British Museum, where you developed those interesting programs also for training of staff, developing exhibition ideas. You went to Mumbai and to support our wonderful colleague, Mr. Mukherjee. And you worked together with him for this, not only, but also for this wonderful exhibition, India and the World, the history in 9 chapters. Maybe just before we end up our discussion, our conversation, could you tell us a little bit about your idea why India and why with the British Museum, and what are the results and how is it going to continue?
Thank you. Well, as you can see, it is the most wonderful museum building in Mumbai. It's in a strange way, again, a kind of sister museum of the British Museum, because it is, as always, by confusion and incompetence, the British managed, the collection got there rather by mistake. When excavations were taking place in Mesopotamia, everything had to be brought in a small boat from Iraq, from the Gulf of Persia to Mumbai, and then it was put into bigger ships to go to England. But regularly, some things got into the wrong place and got left by mistake in Mumbai and wound up in the museum here. So, which is a very happy mistake. So the collections have always been quite closely connected, and we work very closely together. When we began talking, Mumbai is, of course, a very world city, has always been trading with everybody. What the colleagues in Mumbai wanted to do was to try to tell the history of India differently. One of the great difficulties of telling history outside Europe and North America is that most national museums only have objects from their own country. So Cairo can only show the history of Egypt, the Chinese National Museum has only Chinese objects, and so on. And this is where the conversation with Mr. Mukherjee began. He wanted to show the story of India, not through Indian objects only, but how India had its place in the world from the beginning. And how you could tell that history. So we decided that for these purposes, the British Museum would be the lending library. The Indian colleagues would decide what they wanted to borrow from the rest of the world's cultures. They would provide the Indian side. And the idea was to take 9 moments that every Indian school child would know. What are the moments in your history you learn at school? So that every time you went into a new room, you would begin with something that you'd known since you were 11 or 12 as your history. And then objects from China, from Mexico, from Europe, from Africa, would come from the British Museum and go around those objects. And the idea was to tell a national history in a global context. So not a nationalist history, but the story of one country in the story of the world. And the hope was that this might be a model for other countries, because if you were doing the same in Korea, there would be different moments that every child would know at different periods of history. So you would want to put different things around it. Well, you were there last week. It seems to have worked extremely well. And there's a big school program, a big education program. But what I'm really pleased about is that I think it's the first time that such a big exhibition has been organized with the choice of the objects from a European or an American museum not being made by the lending museum at all. The role being simply to be, as it were, a library.
And it was very impressive for us, the group of international museum directors, to see the really high standard of the exhibition, and of course the strong will of Mr. Mukherjee and his team to collaborate with European and with American museums, staff training and all these things. And I think we will continue this dialogue with our wonderful colleague. Well, thank you so much, Neil, for your inspirational words, for sharing your views and your experience with us. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to extend my thanks to the contemporary patrons of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, to RSM, to the Hotel Sans Souci, and to Panas, and to Jasper Sharp for organizing these talks for us. Please feel free to stay a little bit more to have discussions. Neil will probably have a glass. And I just want to remind you that there is a next talk to come, an evening with Cecily Brown on December 11th, where I hope that many of you will come back again. Thank you very much for this great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.